Hey there, I'm Dylan Stafford. My book is Daddy Muscles, and I'm going to read a chapter called Cemetery Sudoku. I wrote this January 15th, 2008. My little son was about 8 months old. My plane landed in Phoenix early, close to rush hour. Taxi and rental car both cost the same amount, but a rental car would allow me to visit my maternal grandparents before I had to give a recruitment speech for my UCLA job that evening at a local hotel. At the airport, I followed the signs and shuttles and placed a phone call to reserve a rental car. I spent the extra $10 of my own money and got the GPS unit. I called my mother, got the name and address of the cemetery where my grandparents were buried, and dialed it into the little dashboard navigator. Oh, and by the way, when you get there, it's easy to find their gravesite. It's under an olive tree, where the graveled area meets the grassy area, Mom told me. My mom grew up in Tempe, Arizona. In the 1950s, before urban sprawl, Tempe was still out in the country. To go on a date with my mom or one of her sisters, a guy had to drive out of town some ways and then down the long driveway that was the entrance to my grandfather's small homestead and ranch. In the 1970s, when I was a kid visiting my grandparents with my family, Tempe still smelled overwhelmingly of orange blossoms, depending on the season. The ranch was closer to town by then, Tempe having grown, and a big highway spur, Highway 60, the Superstition, had grown up along one side of the ranch and interrupted the sun-up to sundown horizon that my mom grew up with. But my grandparents' ranch was still a paradise to visit. There was a modest two-story farmhouse with everything impressive to a young boy surrounding it. Horses, chickens, dogs and cats, and flocks of guard geese who hissed like hellions. These my grandfather had bought to eat the weeds in the orange orchard that covered the back half of the world he had created. My grandmother had a small building that she converted into a library. It seemed normal to me as a child, but looking back I'm more impressed. A library? She had a fully stocked library in her house. I was remembering snippets of those 1970s visits as I followed the sing-songy lady GPS voice towards the cemetery. Turn left in 500 yards, 300 yards. Texas to Arizona by car in the 1970s. When my dad was a small-town minister and our family car was a 1969 Volkswagen bus, was a big trip, both financially and distance-wise. I think we must have arranged a trip every other year, making the long exit from Dallas to El Paso to cut the corner of New Mexico and finally come into the Valley of the Sun of Phoenix. We did it often enough to make memories. Now that I have my own son, I see with new eyes the goal of making memories. Arriving at destination, my GPS lady friend announces. I keep waiting for the GPS people to install a sexy voice option. Grocery store ahead, big fella. I waited to cut through the thickening afternoon traffic. A hole opened up and I darted my rental car into the quiet of a desert cemetery. I tried to think back to my last visit. I couldn't actually remember the visit itself. Rather, I remembered two images. One, a video I'd made in the cemetery with my grandmother, the last time she and I had visited Grandpa's grave together. And the second image, a still photograph of my tall cousin Joel leaning against the olive tree by Grandmother's gravesite on the day of her burial. It was the olive tree memory of Joel that guided me as I got out of my car, looking to find their headstone, Grandma and Grandpa. The cemetery was larger than I remembered. Most childhood places revisited get smaller. It was funny that this was not the case today. There were also more olive trees, a lot more. No one else was around, no cars, no people. The traffic and the freeway weren't that far away, but here in the actual cemetery they both faded into the distance. I saw a big desert jackrabbit up ahead, the kind with the long lope and the black accents at the end of their ears. That took me back to the 70s again. Jackrabbits and roadrunners were two of the more exotic animals we'd see, my younger brother John and me, as we prowled around Grandpa's ranch. Rabbits in Arizona were different in size and coloring, and roadrunners didn't even exist where our family lived in Texas. I tested a few olive trees, remembering the photo and also watching for where the grass meets the gravel. This won't take too long, I thought, but I didn't have any luck. I dialed up my mom again. I'm here in the cemetery. It's a calm January afternoon. It must be in the 60s and the buttes are red and orange and beautiful, I reported. Even though my mom left Arizona at 18, and has lived the rest of her life in Texas, a part of her always feels connected to the Southwest. She'd been driving the first time we spoke, and now she was back home. so I was hoping the second conversation would yield more clues. She repeated her directions but didn't have any new details. Instead, she suggested I call her brother, or her sisters, my uncle and aunts. I reached one aunt. No luck on gravesite details, but a nice conversation. After I reached Cousin Joel, the same cousin in my memory of the olive tree. Joel is one of my favorite cousins, and we caught up on jobs, kids, and life. He did not know where the gravesite was either, but we were having a great conversation. Not knowing what else to do, I went back to the edge of the cemetery and started over. I methodically marched up and down, looking for clues, the same way I would work a Sudoku puzzle. Joel and I shared stories. He had a bum situation in a new job. I told him about my challenges last year with the promotion and then with our pregnancy. Up and down the cemetery row, slide over a row, repeat. I came across 4 other grave sites with my mother's maiden name, and finally I found my grandparents' gravesite. There they were. There was the olive tree, which looked like all the other olive trees. My rental car was small and distant across the way. My dress shoes had a layer of mauve-colored dust on them from crunching along the gravel. The afternoon shadows had grown longer. Joel and I completed our conversation, and I put my cell phone on vibrate. I didn't know what else to do, so I knelt down by their graveside, and I said the Lord's Prayer. Then, I told Grandma and Grandpa about their great-grandson, Jack. I let them know he was healthy and happy, that he was a redhead with a ready smile. I thanked Grandma again for being a librarian and an avid reader, and supporting my own imagination when I was a 6th grader, when I received from her my very own Dungeons & Dragons starter kit. I was the first boy in my circle to know about Dungeons & Dragons. Lots of teenage boys played Dungeons & Dragons, but how many were introduced to it by their grandmothers? Some of my friends' parents heard D&D was somehow devilish, this being Texas, but I remember thinking, how could it be bad? It's from my grandma. Kneeling at her grave, I told her that we were reading lots of books to Jack, every night before sleepy time. I know that I get much of my love of language from her. I told them I was blissfully happy in my marriage. I plucked an orange from an orange tree nearby, remembering how big Grandpa's orange orchard had seemed when I was a kid, how scary his guard geese had been. I remembered a visit to this same cemetery with my grandmother when she was still alive. "Those are sour oranges," she had said. "You can't eat them." The white noise of the traffic seemed even farther away. It was quiet in the deep, deserted pocket of the afternoon in this cemetery. I was aware of my ancestors and of all the lives of all the people buried here. I felt small and I felt peaceful. I placed my orange, my sour orange, on top of Grandma and Grandpa's gravestone. It felt fitting to honor them with the fruit, even if it was not sweet and edible. Their great-grandson was alive and well in the world, and I wanted to acknowledge them for that precious gift. I looked up to the heavens and I smiled before walking back across the gravel path to my rental car. Thanks for listening.